They sent him to kill Bumpy Johnson. That was the order. Simple, clean, final. A bullet in Harlem, a body in the street, and a message sent to anyone who still believed Bumpy Johnson was untouchable. The man stood across the street from the Uptown Cotton Club, coat collar turned up against the cold, hand heavy in his pocket where the steel waited. Midnight traffic whispered past on 7th Avenue. Neon light flickered. Somewhere inside, jazz spilled out like a confession. Bumpy Johnson was inside that building, laughing, drinking, alive. The shooter had been watching him for 3 nights. He knew Bumpy's habits, knew the way he walked, slow, deliberate, like a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. Knew the pause Bumpy always took before stepping into the street, eyes scanning not with fear, but with calculation. A man who'd survived too long to rush anything. This was supposed to be easy, but nothing about standing across from Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson ever was. Because Bumpy didn't just move through Harlem, he commanded it. The shooter shifted his weight, heart beating faster now. He'd killed before. Men like him always had. But this was different. This wasn't some corner hustler or rival muscle. This was the man who'd stared down the mafia and made them negotiate. The man politicians pretended not to know, and police pretended they could control. The legend himself stepped out into the cold. Bumpy Johnson wore a dark overcoat, tailored sharp, hat pulled low. His face was calm, unreadable. No bodyguards flanking him, no visible weapon. Just that steady walk, unbothered, unhurried. That was when Bumpy stopped. Right there on the curb. He didn't look left. He didn't look right. He looked straight across the street. Straight at the man sent to kill him. For a moment, Harlem seemed to hold its breath. The shooter felt it then. The weight. The unmistakable feeling of being seen by someone who understood violence the way a preacher understands sin. Bumpy tilted his head slightly, not in fear, in recognition. Then he raised his hand, not to surrender, not to threaten, to beckon. The man's fingers tightened around the gun. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Targets didn't invite you over. Legends didn't look you in the eye like they already knew the end of the story. But the shooter crossed the street anyway, because when Bumpy Johnson called you forward, you didn't pretend you didn't hear. Harlem in the 1930s and 40s was a city within a city, alive, dangerous, brilliant, and trapped. Black-owned businesses thrived beside numbers runners and jazz clubs. Politics, crime, survival, and pride all collided on the same blocks, and standing at the center of it all was Bumpy Johnson. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He didn't need to be. His reputation arrived before he did, built on intelligence, discipline, and a refusal to bow to anyone who thought Harlem was theirs to exploit. Born in South Carolina and sharpened in New York, Bumpy came up in a world that offered black men 2 choices, submission or defiance. He chose neither. He chose control. By the time the Italian mobs realized Harlem wasn't just another neighborhood to squeeze dry, Bumpy Johnson had already built relationships, influence, and an understanding of power that went beyond brute force. He read poetry in prison. He negotiated like a diplomat, and when necessary, he answered disrespect with precision. That balance made him dangerous. To the mafia, he was an obstacle. To corrupt officials, he was a problem. To Harlem, he was protection, which was why the contract had been written. The order didn't come from the streets. It came from higher up. Men in clean suits who didn't like that a black man had leverage they couldn't control. They didn't want a war. They wanted an erasure. Quiet, final. The shooter was chosen because he wasn't known. No ties to Harlem. No emotional connection. Just skill, discipline, and silence. He'd been told Bumpy was arrogant now, comfortable, slipping. They lied. As the two men stood face to face under the glow of a street lamp, Bumpy studied him the way a chess master studies a reckless move. "You're a long way from home," Bumpy said calmly, his voice low, measured. The shooter didn't answer. Bumpy smiled, not with humor, but understanding. "They told you I wouldn't see you coming," Bumpy continued. "That I'd be drunk, distracted, that you'd walk away richer tonight." The man swallowed. Bumpy stepped closer, close enough that the shooter could smell his cologne, close enough to know this man feared nothing in his pocket. "They didn't tell you," Bumpy said, "that everyone who comes for me brings something back with them." The shooter's grip loosened. The gun stayed hidden. For the first time since taking the job, doubt took root. Because this wasn't a man begging for his life. This was a man offering a choice. And Harlem had a way of remembering which choice you made. The streetlight hummed above them. Somewhere a car horn blared. Life went on. But history was about to change direction. And the man sent to kill Bumpy Johnson was about to walk away, carrying a warning instead. The shooter didn't move. Not because he was brave. Because something in Bumpy Johnson's eyes told him that any sudden motion would be a mistake he wouldn't live long enough to regret. Bumpy turned slightly, angling his body away from the street, as if the two men were nothing more than old acquaintances sharing a quiet word. To anyone watching, and there were always eyes in Harlem, it looked unremarkable. Just two men talking under a street lamp. That was how Bumpy preferred it. Violence, when it came, should never be sloppy. "They paying you good?" Bumpy asked. The shooter hesitated. That hesitation was answer enough. "Good enough?" he finally said. Bumpy nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. "They always do. First time." The man stiffened. "I've done work before." "I'm sure you have," Bumpy replied. "But this one's different. You can feel that, can't you?" The shooter said nothing. His jaw tightened. Bumpy glanced down the street, then back at him. "You know why they picked you?" he asked. "Because if you disappear, nobody asks questions. No ties, no noise." The shooter's eyes narrowed. "You threatening me?" Bumpy smiled again, thin, controlled. "No, I'm explaining the math." That was Bumpy Johnson's gift. He didn't intimidate with volume. He educated. He laid out consequences the way a banker laid out numbers. Clean, undeniable. "I don't know your name," Bumpy continued, "but I know your type. You follow instructions. You finish jobs. You think that makes you invisible." Bumpy leaned in, voice dropping lower. "In Harlem, nothing is invisible." The man shifted his feet now. He felt it. The presence beyond Bumpy himself. Windows, corners, shadows. Harlem wasn't staring openly, but it was aware. Bumpy took a step back and gestured toward the club behind him. "Come inside," he said. "Have a drink." The shooter let out a short, disbelieving breath. "You think I'm stupid?" Bumpy's expression hardened, not with anger, but disappointment. "If you were stupid, you'd already be dead." That landed. Slowly, the shooter removed his hand from his pocket. The gun stayed hidden, but the intent was exposed now, disarmed not by force, but by inevitability. They walked. Inside the club, smoke hung thick in the air. The band was packing up, instruments murmuring as tired men wiped sweat from their brows. Conversations quieted when Bumpy entered. Not stopped, softened. Respect didn't need silence to announce itself. They took a corner table. A server appeared without being called. 2, Bumpy said simply. The shooter sat stiff-backed, eyes scanning exits. He noticed what most outsiders missed, how no one stared too long, how every movement around Bumpy was measured, deferential, but not fearful. This wasn't a tyrant's court. This was a leader's territory. You don't have to do this, the shooter said quietly. I can walk away. Bumpy nodded. You can, but that won't change why you're here. The drinks arrived. Bumpy didn't touch his. Men like the ones who hired you, Bumpy said. They don't forgive hesitation. You come back empty-handed, they'll want a reason. The shooter looked up sharply. Then why let me live? Bumpy met his gaze. Because I don't need another dead man in the street. I need a message delivered. The words settled heavy between them. Tell them, Bumpy continued, that I know who's nervous. Tell them Harlem is not up for sale, and tell them this. He leaned forward now, voice steel-wrapped calm. Next time they send someone, I won't invite him in. The shooter stared at him, pulse thundering in his ears. And if they don't listen? Bumpy finally lifted his glass, took a single sip. Then they'll learn, he said. Same as everyone else. The shooter left 10 minutes later. No handshake, no threats. Just a look exchanged at the door. One man walking back into the night carrying something heavier than a gun. A warning. Word traveled fast in Harlem, but it traveled even faster uptown, downtown, and across the river into rooms where men in tailored suits pretended not to sweat. The message landed hard. They hadn't expected restraint. They hadn't expected conversation. And they certainly hadn't expected the man they sent to come back shaken, eyes sharper, voice quieter. He knew, the shooter told them, before I crossed the street. That was the problem, because Bumpy Johnson wasn't reacting anymore. He was anticipating, and that meant the balance had shifted. The men who ordered the hit didn't back down immediately. Men like that rarely did. But they paused. Meetings were postponed, decisions delayed. Nobody wanted to be the next one underestimated. Meanwhile, Bumpy went on with his life. He walked his streets. He checked on businesses. He handled disputes with the same steady hand. No celebration, no announcement. Because real power didn't need reminders. But beneath the calm, tension coiled. Because when a warning is ignored, it stops being a courtesy. And Harlem was about to see what happened when patience ran out. Warnings only work on men who still believe in consequences. For a few weeks after the message was delivered, things went quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that didn't mean peace. It meant calculation. Harlem felt it. The numbers runners felt it. The club owners felt it. Even the police, who claimed ignorance whenever Bumpy Johnson's name came up, felt it too. Bumpy felt it most of all. Because restraint, when mistaken for weakness, invites disrespect. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning. A small grocery on Lenox Avenue, black-owned, family-run, protected under Bumpy's umbrella, found its windows smashed before dawn. No robbery, no vandalism for profit, just broken glass and a message carved into the doorframe. Time's up. Bumpy stood across the street, hands folded behind his back, eyes cold as he took it in. The owner, an older man with shaking hands, kept apologizing. I paid on time, the man said. Every week, I swear it." Bumpy placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know," he said. That was enough to steady him. By the end of the week, 2 more businesses were hit. Subtle but deliberate. No bodies, no headlines, just pressure. That's how the men behind it operated. They didn't want war. They wanted compliance. They wanted Bumpy to understand that warnings didn't change the rules. But Bumpy Johnson had never played by rules written without him. He called a meeting that night. Not flashy. No speeches. Just the men who mattered. Lieutenants, connectors, the ones who understood that Harlem survived because someone kept the wolves at bay. "They test in us," one of them said. Bumpy nodded. "I know." "So what's the move?" Bumpy looked around the room, measuring each face. Loyalty wasn't blind. It was earned through consistency. "We don't rush," he said. "We don't overreact. And we don't let them think this is going unanswered." That was Bumpy's brilliance. He understood that power wasn't about how fast you struck, but where. The next night, one of the men linked to the intimidation was arrested, not by chance and not by corruption. A quiet tip about a violation he couldn't wriggle out of. No violence, just inconvenience. Then another found his supply delayed. Another lost access to a key meeting. Doors closed softly but firmly. Pressure applied with intelligence. The shooter heard about it from a distance. He wasn't involved anymore. He didn't want to be. But he recognized the pattern. Bumpy Johnson wasn't retaliating. He was dismantling. That made the men who ordered the hit nervous. And nervous men make mistakes. The mistake came in the form of a second message, this one louder. A car belonging to one of Bumpy's trusted drivers was set on fire in broad daylight. No attempt at concealment, no apology afterward. That was a line. Bumpy arrived at the scene minutes after the flames were out. Police milled around, pretending interest. One of them smirked. "Looks like you're having trouble keeping order," the officer said. Bumpy met his gaze. "Order's fine," he replied. "This is just noise." The officer laughed. "That's so?" Bumpy stepped closer, close enough that the laughter faded. "Just make sure your men stay clear when it gets quiet again," Bumpy said calmly. The officer didn't respond. He didn't have to, because everyone knew what quiet meant in Harlem. That night, Bumpy reached out, not to soldiers, but to intermediaries, men who could walk into rooms where guns stayed holstered and voices stayed low. He didn't ask for peace, he asked for clarity. The response came 2 days later, a meeting, neutral ground, a warehouse near the river, no weapons on the table, at least none visible. Bumpy arrived alone. The men across from him didn't expect that. "You're confident," one of them said, trying to sound amused. Bumpy took a seat. "I'm informed." They talked around the issue at first. Business, territory, respect. The usual dance men performed when neither side wanted to say what they were really thinking. Finally, one of them leaned forward. "You survived a long time, Bumpy," he said, "but things change." Bumpy didn't blink. "So do funerals." The room went still. "You got a warning," the man continued. "You didn't listen." Bumpy shook his head slowly. "No, you did." Silence stretched. Bumpy stood. "This ends now," he said. "Or it ends the way it always does, for people who think Harlem answers to them." He walked out without waiting for a reply. That was the moment the decision was made, not by Bumpy, but by the men who realized too late that killing him had been the simpler option. The order went out again. Different man, different plan. This time, There would be no conversation. And Bumpy Johnson knew it. The second man wasn't like the first. Where the first had hesitated, this one didn't. Where the first had listened, this one followed orders the way a machine followed instructions, without curiosity, without doubt. He arrived in Harlem on a Friday night when the streets were thick with sound and movement. That was intentional. Noise hid violence. Crowds created confusion, and confusion gave killers space to disappear. Bumpy Johnson knew he was coming, not because someone warned him, because Harlem shifted. Bumpy had lived long enough to recognize when the air tightened, conversations shortened, eyes lingered. The rhythm of the street went slightly offbeat, like a record spinning just a hair too fast. He felt it walking down 135th Street, cane tapping lightly against the pavement. Not for balance, but for pace. He wore no armor, no visible weapon. Same as always. That's what unsettled men the most. He stopped at a newsstand and paid for a paper he didn't read. The vendor's hands shook as he took the money. "You should head home early tonight," Bumpy said quietly. The vendor nodded without asking why. 2 blocks later, Bumpy turned into an alley. Not a shortcut, a decision. The second man watched from across the street, pulse steady, timing perfect. He didn't rush. Rushing got you sloppy. He waited until Bumpy disappeared from view, then crossed, coat brushing against passers-by who never noticed him. The alley was dim, narrow, littered with the remnants of the day, crates, trash, echoes, the kind of place men vanished. Bumpy stood, halfway down, back turned, hands clasped behind him. The second man raised the gun. "Don't," Bumpy said. The word wasn't loud. It wasn't pleading. It was final. The man froze. Slowly, Bumpy turned. "You're not the first," Bumpy said, "and you won't be the last. But you're standing in the wrong place to make a name." The gun didn't lower. "That's the difference between you and the last one," Bumpy continued. "He wanted to survive." The man sneered. "I'm not here to talk." "I know," Bumpy said. "That's why you're here instead of him." The gun fired, but not at Bumpy. A sharp crack echoed as the bullet shattered a bottle against the brick wall, inches from Bumpy's head. The shooter's wrist twisted violently as a figure emerged from the shadows behind him. Fast, precise, silent. The second man hit the ground hard, breath driven from his lungs. The gun skittered away. Bumpy didn't move. 2 men stepped into the light now. Not soldiers, not thugs. Harlem men. The kind who blended into the street until they didn't. "You all right, Bump?" one asked. Bumpy nodded once. "Call it in." The shooter groaned, trying to push himself up. One of the men pressed a foot to his chest. "Easy," he said. "You done?" Bumpy crouched beside him, close enough that the man could see the disappointment in his eyes. "They told you I walked alone," Bumpy said, "that I trusted my reputation more than my instincts." The man spat blood. "You think this changes anything?" Bumpy stood. "It changes everything." The police arrived within minutes. Too fast for coincidence, too slow to stop anything. They took statements they wouldn't file, asked questions they didn't want answered. The shooter was taken away alive. That was intentional, because dead men told no stories, and Bumpy Johnson wanted this one told clearly. By morning, the message had spread farther than any bullet could travel. The man who went to kill Bumpy Johnson didn't die in an alley. He was caught, alive. And that terrified the people who'd sent him, because interrogation didn't require loyalty, only time. and time had a way of loosening even the tightest mouths. Within 48 hours, intermediaries reached out, not with threats, with apologies. They wanted to talk again, wanted to reset the situation, wanted assurances that things wouldn't escalate. Bumpy agreed, on his terms. The meeting took place in a back room above a restaurant that served men who liked to pretend they were invisible. This time, Bumpy brought no one. Neither did they. The tension was different now, heavier, uneven. "You made your point," one of them said carefully. Bumpy shook his head. "No, I finished yours." They spoke plainly this time. No circling, no performance. "You misjudged me," Bumpy said. "And worse, you misjudged Harlem." One of the men cleared his throat. "What do you want?" Bumpy didn't hesitate. "Respect," he said, "and distance." They nodded, because there was nothing left to negotiate. Harlem noticed the change immediately. The pressure stopped. Businesses reopened without fear. Police patrols backed off, not because they were ordered to, but because nobody wanted to be caught in the middle of something they couldn't control. Bumpy Johnson returned to his routines, but his legend changed shape. He was no longer just the man who negotiated with giants. He was the man who gave warnings and proved what happened when they were ignored. The aftermath didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It came with absence. No more broken windows. No more burned cars. No more anonymous pressure meant to remind Harlem who supposedly owned it. The streets noticed first. They always did. Business owners reopened earlier. Conversations grew louder again. Music spilled out of clubs without that tight edge of fear riding underneath the sound. People walked with their shoulders set just a little higher, because justice in Harlem didn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wore a dark overcoat and moved quietly through the neighborhood, correcting imbalances before they turned into funerals. The man who'd been caught in the alley never made it to trial, not because he disappeared, because the charges stuck. The gun, the intent, the witnesses nobody expected to come forward. The system did what it rarely did. It followed through. And the men who'd sent him knew better than to interfere. They let it happen, because interfering would have meant admitting too much. And because they understood something now that they hadn't before. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to kill you to end you. He just needed to outlast you. The shooter from the first night, the one who'd carried the warning back, heard about the arrest while sitting in a diner miles away. He stirred his coffee slowly, hand unsteady. He thought about how close he'd come to making the wrong decision, about how the legend he'd been sent to erase had instead reshaped his future. Some men earned survival. Others were granted it. Bumpy went on walking Harlem. He checked on the grocery owner personally, paid for the repairs without making a show of it. When the man tried to thank him publicly, Bumpy stopped him. "Take care of your people," Bumpy said. "That's thanks enough." That was the justice Bumpy believed in, not humiliation, not blood. Stability. The police took notice too. Not officially. Never officially. But patrol patterns shifted. Certain officers requested reassignment. Others learned to keep their comments to themselves. One captain, known for his slick insults and thin smile, watched Bumpy pass one afternoon and said nothing. That silence was earned. The men downtown, the ones who'd ordered the hit, restructured quietly. They found other territories, other plays. Harlem was crossed off their map, not out of fear, but calculation. Because challenging Bumpy Johnson no longer offered reward, only cost. Years later, people would talk about that night in different ways. Some would say Bumpy had eyes everywhere. Others would say he was protected by luck. A few would insist it was all exaggerated. Bumpy never corrected them. Legends didn't argue facts. They let results speak. And the result was clear. After that second attempt, no one ever sent another man to kill Bumpy Johnson without first asking if the man wanted to come back alive. Most declined, because Harlem had made its position known. Bumpy's power wasn't rooted in fear alone. That was the mistake outsiders made when trying to understand him. Fear faded. Fear bred resentment. Bumpy built something more durable. Balance. He kept violence contained, not unleashed. He made sure the streets stayed livable even when the world beyond them didn't care if they burned. He dealt with criminals and politicians the same way, with clarity and consequence. That was why, even after prison stints, even after betrayals and shifts in power, his name remained. He wasn't the loudest legend. He was the most respected. One evening, long after the danger had passed, Bumpy stood outside the same club where the first shooter had crossed the street. The neon sign flickered like an old memory. A young man lingered nearby, watching him with curiosity and something like awe. "They say nobody can touch you," the young man said. Bumpy looked at him. "They say a lot of things," he replied. "What's true?" the man asked. Bumpy paused, then spoke quietly. "Everybody can be touched," he said. "The question is whether it's worth reaching." The young man nodded, understanding only part of it. That was enough. The warning had been delivered, the justice had been administered, and Harlem stood. Time has a way of sanding the sharpest edges off most stories, but the ones that endure, the real ones, don't fade. They settle into the bones of a place. They get told quietly, passed from one generation to the next, not as myth, but as instruction. The night they tried to kill Bumpy Johnson and failed became one of those stories, not because of the gunfire, not because of the alley, but because of what followed. After that night, Harlem entered a different phase of its long, complicated life. The outside pressure never disappeared entirely. It never does. But it adjusted. It learned restraint. It learned to ask before taking, to negotiate instead of assuming. That shift didn't come from violence alone. It came from precedent. Bumpy Johnson had drawn a line that didn't require constant defense. It existed because everyone involved understood it was real. Historians would later argue about how much influence one man could truly hold. They'd point to broader forces, economics, politics, race. They'd be right, but they'd also be missing something essential. Because communities don't just respond to systems. They respond to figures. And Bumpy Johnson was a figure Harlem could orient itself around. He proved that power didn't have to be loud to be effective. That resistance didn't always wear a uniform or carry a slogan. Sometimes it wore a tailored coat and spoke in measured tones. After the attempted hit, younger men approached him differently, not with bravado, but with attention. They listened more, learned patience, understood that survival in Harlem wasn't about how fast you could pull a trigger, but about when you chose not to. Bumpy never recruited them into legend. He warned them away from shortcuts. "This life takes more than it gives," he told one group. "If you don't know why you're in it, it'll eat you." That wasn't something they expected to hear from a man with his reputation. But that was the contradiction that defined him. He operated in the underworld without surrendering to it. Even law enforcement quietly adjusted their internal calculus. Bumpy Johnson wasn't treated like an ordinary target anymore. He was considered a constant, an immovable variable. They didn't like it, but they respected it. And respect in environments built on force was the closest thing to peace. The man who'd been sent to kill Bumpy, the first one, would eventually leave New York altogether. He didn't talk about that night. He didn't need to. He carried it with him. He'd looked into the eyes of a man who didn't need to threaten him to win. That stayed. By the time Bumpy's name was spoken in the same breath as national figures, mob bosses, political operators, power brokers, Harlem already knew who he was. He was the man who turned assassination into negotiation. The man who answered disrespect with structure. The man who understood that real dominance wasn't about how many men you could bury, but how many you could keep alive under your protection. That was the legacy cemented by that warning. Not the myth of invincibility, but the reality of consequence. Years later, after prison terms and comebacks, after alliances shifted, and the city tried to forget its own contradictions, Bumpy Johnson's story remained anchored by moments like that one. Moments where the expected outcome failed. Moments where violence was available and deliberately avoided. Those moments mattered because they revealed something deeper than legend. They revealed control. Harlem didn't need Bumpy to live forever. It needed him to stand long enough to prove a point. And that point had been made the night a man crossed the street with a gun and walked away, carrying a warning instead. This wasn't just a story about a hit that failed. It was about a moment when violence was expected and restraint rewrote the outcome. When powerful men believed erasing Bumpy Johnson would be easy, they misunderstood what made him dangerous in the first place. They thought his strength was rooted in fear, in guns, in muscle. They were wrong. Bumpy Johnson's real power was understanding when violence mattered, and when it didn't. He knew that killing a man could end a problem for a night, but forcing a man to walk back, carrying a warning, could end it for years. That's why Harlem didn't burn after that attempt. That's why the street stayed standing. That's why his name carried weight long after others faded into footnotes. This wasn't about ego. It was about dignity, about a community that had been treated like territory instead of home, and a man who refused to let outsiders decide its fate without consequence. The man sent to kill him walked away alive, but changed. The men who ordered it walked away humbled, and Harlem walked away with something rare in those days: balance. Because sometimes the most legendary response isn't pulling the trigger. It's making sure the world knows you could have and chose something smarter instead. That's why Bumpy Johnson wasn't just feared, he was respected. And in places where respect is the only real currency, that makes all the difference.